Hey everyone, my name is Mike, and welcome to Crooked Commander, the show dedicated to showcasing some of the most interesting hidden gems of Commander deck building. The goal is not to showcase the quote-unquote best deck lists, but rather those that go off the beaten path to achieve something unique. For this episode, I'm going to discuss a deck of mine that goes for a very different strategy than I typically like to play. If you've seen my other videos, you know that I am an aggro player at heart. So what happens when I choose to slow it down? You get Kambal, Console of Allocation. Kambal costs 1 generic, 1 white, and 1 black mana for a 2/3 legendary human advisor. He has a single ability that reads, whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, that player loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. This deck is definitely a life drain strategy, but the way it goes about it is what makes this deck list more unique. Before I get into it, I'd like to take some time to talk about my history with this deck and how it came to be. If you'd like to jump straight into the deck list, feel free to skip ahead to the timestamp shown. Back when I was in college, the Battle for Zendikar set released, giving us Expedition lands. These were special chase printings of shock lands, fetch lands, and what I've learned are called Tango lands, which come in tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. I ended up pulling the Expedition Sacred Foundry, and a fellow member of our college Magic group desperately wanted it. It was around this time where I was becoming displeased with my first commander deck being Niv Mizzet the Firemind, and I was looking for a new alternative. If you would like more detail on that story, feel free to check out my episode on Veyran once you finish with this one. While trying to find a new strategy, I found myself drawn to Life Drain, and this member had an idea for the perfect trade. He had a fully built Life Drain deck that he was willing to trade me in exchange for the Sacred Foundry. After taking a look at the deck list, I agreed. The commander was Ghost Council of Orjava. I wish I had saved this original deck list back in the day so I could provide a better concept for what it was, but from what I remember, it focused on flickering the commander and generating creature tokens. I played and edited this deck through a few more set blocks until we reached spoiler season for Kaladesh. When they first showed us Kambal, Console of Allocation, my novice brain lost its mind. This was a cheaper mana value commander in the same colors with a much more broad and efficient ability to take advantage of. Kambal became my second ever commander and is currently my longest running commander deck. Life Drain spells could take up more spaces in the deck, while also being able to rely on my opponent's non-creature spells to push it even faster. General win conditions involve the Sanguine Bond and Exquisite Blood combo, which causes you to gain life and your opponents to lose life infinitely, as well as the, at the time, newly printed Aether Flux Reservoir. I also included about 4 tutors to help get those pieces out. The main issue I faced with this deck was its general slowness and lack of consistency when it came to getting my win conditions out. I was lucky to have received the tutors I had by that point and was not in a position to pick up the more expensive options. This eventually came to a head when I graduated and found my place at a local game store. They had Commander Night every week and everyone who participated was randomly placed in pods regardless of power level, competing for packs. I can happily report that this is no longer the case and they allow separation between competitive and casual. As the competitive community grew, I found that I never came close to competing at that level and decided that I needed to change my approach to match it. There was a ton of interaction going on in these pods and Kambal already took advantage of that. My favorite story to tell during this time was when someone in my pod was playing an Urza High Lord Artificer deck. He countered my commander as I attempted to cast it for the 3rd time that game, saying, "Sorry, but I'm at 13 life and I don't have enough left to win if I let that resolve." I simply laughed and said, "No worries, I get it." That implanted the idea in my head that I could make these stronger strategies struggle even more. So, I took the deck all the way back to the drawing board. Kambal's Court of Law focuses on spells that punish my opponents for doing just about anything, or at the very least slowing them down, without expressly stopping them from being able to play the game or dropping fully into Stacks territory. Please be seated, as the court is now in session. Here's how I do it. I'm going to start by acknowledging that Stacks, Prison, or Hate Bear type strategies for this commander is not something new. If you check out Kambal's page on EDHREC, hashtag not a sponsor, you'll see that 2 of those are in the top 3 strategies for the deck. But if you take a look at the numbers, there are only a little over 2,000 decks that run him as the commander, at least as of the time this video is releasing. Less than 100 of those are stacks, and less than 40 of them are hate bears. Compare this to the fact that over half the decks focus solely on winning through life gain. Like many of my decks, I had the spells separated into 6 main categories: ramp, draw, removal, laws, tutor, and win conditions. Starting with ramp, I run mostly mana rocks due to the limited options in my colors. I went with Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Orzhov Signet, Talisman of Hierarchy, Jet Medallion, Pearl Medallion, Felwar Stone, Mind Stone, and Thought Vessel. The standout piece is Smothering Tithe, probably coming to no one's surprise here. In my opinion, it is one of, if not the best ramp spell White has to offer. Moving on to draw, all of the cards in this section are permanents with repeatable draw effects to be used as needed. Arguel's Bloodfast, Black Market Connections, Cosmos Elixir, Esper Sentinel, Greed, Phyrexian Arena, and Trouble in Pairs. Next up is removal. I recently cut this section down by a considerable amount. While spot removal is important, considering everything else this deck does, especially in the laws section, I felt it better to limit removal in support of making sure this deck isn't super oppressive. Anguished Unmaking, damn, Fracture, Requisition Raid, and Vindicate. I also included Karlov of the Ghost Council and No Mercy as a few repeatable options that can loom over your opponents and impact their decisions. Now let's get into the meat of this strategy, the laws that give this deck its namesake. I'll be breaking the section down more so than I have thus far in my other categories and videos, as there are 24 cards in this category. Starting off, we have Archon of Emeria and Eidolon of Rhetoric, which limit the number of spells each player can cast to 1 per turn, with Archon also providing the ability to have your opponent's non-basic lands enter tapped. The other spells I include that force permanents to enter tapped are Kismet and Loxodon Gatekeeper. I include Aura of Silence and Defense Grid as ways to increase the amount of mana it costs for my opponents to cast spells depending on the circumstance. Next are the cards that stop abilities from triggering: Curse Totem, Hushbringer, and Torpor Orb. Next are the spells that punish my opponents for drawing cards: Fate Unraveler, Sheoldred the Apocalypse, and Spirit of the Labyrinth. I've also included cards that punish for simply casting spells: Painful Quandary, Rug of Smothering, and Spelltithe Enforcer. The last subsection are spells that make it harder for my opponents to swing at me: Aurification, Ghostly Prison, and Windborne Muse. The remaining spells are more so one-off effects that didn't really share any characteristics with any of the other categories, and mostly help facilitate more life drain. Aven Mind Sensor, to limit the number of options my opponents have when searching their libraries. Bloodchief Ascension, which causes life drain when cards enter my opponent's graveyards. Palace Siege, which causes life drain on my upkeep. Polluted Bonds, which causes life drain when an opponent plays a land. Sorin Markov, which lets you immediately drop an opponent's life total to 10 and can continue to cause life drain if your opponents let it stick around. And finally, Wound Reflection, to double the amount of life lost at the end of each opponent's turn. Oh, you're still here. Well, alright then, let's talk about the tutors. I have increased the number of tutors from 4 to 6 since this deck's initial build. I could include more, but I didn't want this deck to become a game of quickly and consistently tutoring out my win conditions. I included Demonic Tutor, Diabolic Tutor, Enlightened Tutor, Grim Tutor, Idyllic Tutor, and Vampiric Tutor. Speaking of win conditions, let's get into how this deck actually pulls off a win. The most obvious answer is the Sanguine Bond and Exquisite Blood combo. In this vein, I've also included various spells that mimic Sanguine Bond's ability to have an opponent lose life when I gain life. Those being Cliffhaven Vampire, Marauding Blight Priest, Starscape Cleric, and DeVito Thorn of the Duskrose. I have also included spells that require me to be at a certain life total to win. Aetherflux Reservoir, Felidar Sovereign, and Test of Endurance. The one standout piece here is Sunscorch Regent, and I will admit that this is more of a pet card than an efficient one, but I justify it since it provides life when my opponents cast spells, while also getting bigger to potentially swing in for extra damage needed to finish off an opponent. That just leaves our land base. I'll start with the cards I can tap for both of my commander's colors. Command Tower, Bright Climb / Grime Climb Pathway, Caves of Koilos, Concealed Courtyard, Desolate Mire, Fetid Heath, Godless Shrine, Isolated Chapel, Marsh Flats, Shattered Sanctum, Shine Shadow Snarl, Silent Clearing, Tainted Field, and Vault of Champions. I've also included 2 utility lands, being the Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth and Kambal Coffers combo, where the former turns all lands into swamps in addition to their other types, and the latter provides mana equal to the number of swamps you control. Taking a look at the deck's color costs versus production, they are mostly even with a slight bit more in black, so I chose to round out the mana base with 9 plains and 10 swamps. Before getting into the uniqueness check for this deck, let's talk about the flaws and shortcomings this deck can run into. Some cards in this deck create almost non-bows with each other, where one card limits something, while the other punishes for doing it more. An example of this is Eidolon of Rhetoric, limiting to casting 1 spell per turn, and Rug of Smothering punishing for casting multiple spells a turn. The other thing I've noticed more and more of as time goes on is that many decks these days are adopting more creature-based strategies than there used to be. So you might not get quite as many triggers off Kamball's ability as you might initially expect, but how effective Kambal will be will vary from game to game. This may come as a disappointment to some of you, but I've decided not to include a playtest in this episode. My reason for this is because without actual opponents, it's really hard to see this deck work. But don't fret, you'll get a chance to see this deck in action in a future video I have planned. I've included a link to the deck list in the description if you would still like to check it out. Alright, and here we are at the uniqueness check, as I've decided to call this. So this is just going to list all of the cards in the deck outside of lands, based on unpopularity, compared to other decks that use Kambal as their commander. So we definitely have some high numbers here, and anyone who's unsure, this essentially is showing the percentage of decks that don't run this. So this requisition rate here pretty much does not show up in 80% of Kambal decks. But if you scroll all the way down, you will start to see more and more that the cards I run do become a bit more common, to the point where these last 10 or so are seen in virtually every deck. But like I said, up here at the top, like you really do see some unique things. There are some cards here that I do think are really silly, at least as silly as they are mean. Take Orification, for example. I didn't focus on what this did in the main focus of the video, but this pretty much says whenever a creature deals damage to you, put a gold counter on it. Creatures with gold counters are walls, and walls can't attack. So I thought that was pretty funny. Card that's more mean than it is fun, Spelltide Enforcer. It's such an old card, but next to no one knows about it. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, that player sacks a permanent unless he or she pays one. Yeah, I can see why some of these cards aren't played very often, because they can be mean. But yeah, so this is definitely the meanest deck that I have. I typically do not play it at my local game store unless someone in a casual pod gets a bit too uppity and full of themselves for a win. I pull out Kambal the Humbler. Which, fun fact, is a little sub name I give it outside Court of Law. But hey, thank you so much for checking this out, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Crooked Commander. If you like this type of content and want to see more, leave a like, or consider subscribing. Do you have your own unique commander deck list that you think deserves the spotlight? Leave a comment with a link to the deck list and it might become the subject for a future video. Thank you all again, and happy deck building.